It's time to talk about Justin Cooney's favorite topic, the Toronto Maple Leafs and William Nylander's contract.
I'm starting the Nylander Vancouver rumors right now.
Oh,
starting
God,
right now.
Just a ridiculous trade.
Starting right now.
Everything is
Just
like going
stupid.
back to the Canucks. Well, let's talk to someone who actually knows what's going on, and that's Chris Johnston of North Star Bets. Chris, on your podcast, you mentioned some things about William Nylander that made the rounds in terms of where the Leafs and Nylander are in terms of contract negotiations. What's the latest that you know so far?
Well, I don't really think they're anywhere, to be honest. I mean, certainly there's been some discussion and an offer made by Toronto's side to William Nylander. And I just think that they're so far apart that hasn't yet sparked further conversation, or at least further negotiations on the number. And so it's kind of, in no man's land. And I think that a couple of things are important to highlight here. William Nylander is signed for next season. There's not necessarily any sort of formal deadline where they have to get something worked out or not. And perhaps there's a world where he's back with the Leafs, and even if they don't do a contract extension, just playing out the final year of his deal. So there's still potentially a fair bit of runway. But right now, it just doesn't seem like they were able to catch any lightning in a bottle over the draft week and into free agency here. And I don't think that the sides see the world the same way. And so it's not necessarily a standoff at this point, but certainly doesn't sound like there's much progress that's been made.
Do you think Nylander is worth $10 million a year?
I think you can make the case. I mean, you look at some of the other players and what they've signed this offseason. You have Pierre-Luc Dubois at $8.5 million. You had Timo Meier at $8.8 million. William Nylander has outscored both in goals and in points the best seasons of those players. Now, I think where some of the debate might come in is that those players are 6'3", give or take. That they play center, whereas Nylander's a winger. I mean, that there could be some, that's probably where the finer points of the negotiation come in. But purely by the numbers, I don't think it's an outrageous ask. I just don't know if it's an ask that the Leafs could ever really even seriously consider. And, it's hard to sometimes read a negotiation in real time. I mean, there's always some emotional in these things. Obviously, anyone who's been through one will understand. Maybe you ask for a lot if you're the employee or the player. Maybe the company or the team is trying to keep you down, and you find some middle ground. I think the question William Nylander has to ask himself is, the Leafs are talking about an 8-year contract. The rules only allow him to sign an 8-year extension with the team he's playing for. And if Toronto, say, gets to $9 million per season on 8 years, that's $72 million total. To match that $72 million on a 7-year contract, if he became a free agent, he'd have to get more than $10 million per season. And I think some of it just becomes a numbers game that way in terms of triangulating, what you can do. And that's why I think it is still a little early to say where this is going, because I see, a reason where both sides might start moving in a different direction towards each other, but that just hasn't happened yet here in the early days of July.
Just think about next summer, boys, and Mitchell Marner's negotiations. This is something it's going to be when he wants 15 a year. This time next year it's going to be crazy. I look at this situation, CJ, and I look at the NHL and Gary Bettman and the current CBA, and how teams are punished for drafting well and developing well. The only league in the world that don't give teams a little bit of a kickback in a salary cap kind of system. Has there been any conversation with the CBA moving forward, and in the next one, whenever that is, about addressing that? Because to me, I see these teams, good teams who do well in the draft and develop well, getting just crushed at this time of their development.
Well, and that's the trouble with it, right? I mean, what the system does, because there's no, it's basically a hard salary cap in every way. There's no money that's unaccounted for. There's no exceptions to the rule. It's good for business in pure business terms. I mean, owners are guaranteed not to pay more than 50% of the revenues back to the people they employ, at least the players. Where it's not necessarily great is for individual teams, and teams like the Maple Leafs. I mean, it's good for NHL business when they're a competitive team, when they're playing in the playoffs. That generates more league-wide revenue. And so I think there can be a fine line to walk. To my knowledge, that's never really been seriously contemplated. And I kind of understand it from the league standpoint. I mean, it's a system that works well for their ownership. We can see it in franchise values just skyrocketing every time you see a team get, revalued if maybe they're selling a minority share, or the sale of the Senators, which is, in the process of going through now, is shown that, teams, even in smaller markets, are basically billion-dollar enterprises at this point in time. The next CBA negotiation is in 2026. There's a new head of the NHLPA, Marty Walsh. We'll have to kind of see when he gets his feet a little wetter, I think, when he gets more up to date on the issues, if there's ways or creative ways the players might be able to get a little bit more slackness in the system. But I don't see what would make it happen, to be honest, because I think it really benefits the owners. And the owners carry the hammer in those negotiations.
CJ, let's talk about the moves the Leafs did make the last couple of days. Domi, Bertuzzi, Klingberg, and Ryan O'Reilly. Definitely adding some much-needed snots to this lineup. Which move that did the Leafs make that really caught your eye or you felt was the best move Brad Treliving made?
Well, I mean, some of it's circumstantial, but I think the Tyler Bertuzzi signing is one that is going to – that the Leafs will feel good about, this time next year when they look back on the season he had. And, Tyler Bertuzzi, when free agency first opened on July 1st, had some longer-term offers from teams. He ended up passing those up, and then, the money gets spent quickly. And by the second day of free agency, when he signed with Toronto, there was really only a couple non-playoff teams that were willing to pay him. And then the Leafs one-year offer, which I think was, most appealing to him because it gives him a chance to come back next summer when there will be a much higher salary cap as a free agent. And so, given that I would expect he's pretty much guaranteed to be playing on the left side of two of Toronto's other best players, we'll see how the lines shake out, but it's possible he's playing with Matthews and Marner for much of next season. If not, I would expect them to be with Tavares and Nylander or some version of those players. And so I think between the minutes he's going to play with the line mates he has, the kind of power play the Leafs should have, I think Bertuzzi's in a great spot. And I think he fills a specific need because he's pretty aggressive forechecker, plays with high energy. And I think he brings a little different dimension to the top six that the Leafs haven't had in the past.
Right now, they're over the cap, obviously, with Jake Muzzin maybe going on LTIR, we assume. And let's assume there's a Matt Murray trade at some point. Are they still over the cap at that point? Or do they still need to do some other stuff?
It depends if they're retaining money in a Matt Murray trade.
Right.
I think that would be part of the question. Obviously they'd like to unload all of his, roughly $4.7 million cap hit, but I don't know if that's going to be possible. I mean, the other challenge with the Murray contract right now is it's actually a very high salary. He's actually owed more money than that actual cap hit. So you're not just dumping a cap hit on a team, you're dumping a lot of money that their owner is going to have to pay. And so I think that there'd be a cost to that. I still think there's a chance Matt Murray's bought out. The Leafs would get a second chance at a buyout window if they're taken to salary arbitration by a player. And I would, think that's going to happen with Ilya Samsonov. And so, they do have a couple levers to pull, but it's hard to imagine a world now where Matt Murray's back with the Leafs just because of the money they've committed elsewhere on the roster. I think between that, Muzzin LTIR and perhaps a couple other things. I mean, Brad Treliving would like to still make some changes on the Leafs blue line, and that might involve some money going out the door when you're bringing someone else in. I think that between those couple situations, they'll be able to get cap compliant well in time for having to do so for the start of the season. And, it helps that they have, the best cap guy out there in Brandon Pridham, who's always seems to be managing them, just under the tango line of the salary cap season every year.
CJ, the Leafs aren't the only team that's not cap compliant. Just can you explain how hard it's been for teams to fill out their rosters throughout free agency for the last couple years because the cap has been flat for so many years?
Yeah, it's really tough, and we've seen there's a few knock-on effects, and it can be difficult on the players too, right? I think there's some pretty good players, even as we're recording this. Vladimir Tarasenko still not signed.
Mm-hmm.
Last year Nazem Kadri, if you remember, spent a long time on the open market, relatively speaking, before getting his big deal in Calgary. I mean, if it really is like musical chairs, and because I think it's 4, 5, 6 years in where we've only just seen modest bumps, if any bump at all, that has a lag effect, and it's going to be interesting to see now. Following this year, it's going to go up by 5%, assuming revenues are where they're supposed to be in the NHL, and so it's going to go from 83.5 to 87 to 92. That'll maybe have a reverse effect where some players will be able to get money. We'll see more things pass around, but I look at nothing more, Justin, than some of the trades we've had lately. I mean, Ryan Johansson basically given away to Colorado for the cap space. Another number of other of those types of situations. Taylor Hall went from Boston to Chicago under those circumstances. I mean, useful NHL players now, if they have too big of a cap hit, they'll just give them to a team that has the room to absorb that. And that's kind of strange when you think of it as a concept, because it won't surprise me if Ryan Johansson has a good year for the Avalanche next year.
Will next year be even crazier, CJ, do you think, with obviously a lot more cap space available, more money available, and all these players on current one-year deals?
I think so. I mean, obviously a number of free agents, Matt Duchene elected to do a one-year deal in Dallas. You've got, Bertuzzi and Domi in Toronto. Dmitry Orlov took a 2-year contract going to Carolina, but obviously he could have had longer deals. I think a lot of players have just opted to want to come up again in these next couple of years and to try to hit it richer there. And so I think if anything, what it will do is we'll probably see more contracts. You're going to go like, holy crap, player X got that much. you know, we didn't actually have a lot of that in free agency, really. I mean, if you look at the deal signed, it was a pretty modest period. You might have said, you know, Alex Killorn, given his age, might have been the one deal. You know, I was surprised to see him get $6.25 million over 4 years from Anaheim. I know he's coming off a great season, but he's also 33. That's one of those deals that you might be like, wow, that's a free agency signing. You know, we'll see how it ages. But for the most part, it was a pretty modest period. I think what we're going to see next year in summer 2025 and beyond is more of those head-scratching free agent deals of the past.
Staying in Anaheim here, a lot of rumors about John Gibson and obviously being linked with guess who, Toronto, but other teams as well. Do you think there's much chance of a John Gibson deal being made this off season, not just for the Leafs, but anywhere?
Well, certainly Anaheim has explored it and talked to teams about John Gibson. I think, you know, the challenge is, you know, the Ducks have been you know, kind of a bottom feeding team for the last few years, so his personal numbers don't look as good. And I think what you have to think about is that a decline in his play, or is that really reflective of, you know, a young team in front of him, kind of a rebuilding group? You know, to what degree would you have confidence in John Gibson if you're a contending team to bring him in? The other part is he makes a $6.4 million cap hit. And if you look at goaltenders, I mean, that's top 5 right now in the league. And so if you're not sure about the performance, he's got several years left on that deal. I just think it's too hard of a contract. It's going to be too hard of a contract for the Ducks to move in this environment. It's not to say the guy can't play, and it's not to say that there won't be something that surfaces down the road. But, you know, at this stage of the summer with so many teams, you know, already spent pretty close to the cap, it's going to take a pretty creative deal, I think, for Anaheim to find a new home for Gibson before training camp.
CJ, before we let you go, just a quick update on the Erik Carlson potential trade. We've heard Pittsburgh, Edmonton. Where do you see this shaking out for the San Jose defenseman?
Well, the Sharks really want to get it done. And I think, you know, Erik Carlson, it's in his best interest, too, to get a new home this offseason. So those talks continue now. I think that Carolina is the team that's pushing the hardest at this point in time. You know, Pittsburgh, of course, loves the idea of Erik Carlson. Would be a big splash for Kyle Dubas in his job. But there's, you know, a lot to be worked out, I think, on the Penguins' end to make that, you know, all line up from a cap perspective. You know, the Hurricanes, I think, have the desire to do it. I mean, a pretty bold front office there. We've seen them make a number of big trades. It seems like they're in on everything when you hear Carolina. And so I think that's most likely where he ends up. And, you know, an interesting part of this process is some teams have been given the ability to talk directly to Erik Carlson about their situation, which is important. He has a no movement clause in his contract, so he has to be on board with whatever can materialize here. And you know, really the only thing that's held it up, we see the guy's ability. He just had a 100-point season, another Norris Trophy, but his $11.5 million cap hit is just too hard for most good teams to take on. And so I think the negotiation really has to be player, the acquiring team, and the Sharks all kind of working together, because this is kind of a complex trade. I don't think we've ever seen a trade like it if it ends up happening.
One last question for you, CJ, before you go on vacation and we see you in a few months' time. When you come back from your vacation, how different will the Leafs look compared to right now?
I don't think they'll look too different, honestly. I don't see anything major on the horizon. Obviously, they have big decisions. They have big contracts potentially to give out with extensions to Austin Matthews and William Nylander. You know, as I mentioned, I do expect that Matt Murray will be moved on from in some way, shape, or form between now and September. But I don't see them making any more big splashes. I just think they're too hamstrung by the cap. And as much as Brad Schleving, I'm sure, wants to put even bigger stamp on this roster, I think it's going to take some time for him to be able to do that. So, you know, between now and this time next year, I think there'll be a lot, you know, between the moves that can be made in season, and then, you know, the Leafs are going to have some decisions next summer with a number of free agents again on the books. But I think most of the work is done now. And look, we can all talk about what the Leafs have done in the playoffs. The last 3 regular seasons, they were a top 5 team in the league. And so, you know, I know that everyone has an opinion on what needs to change and what doesn't, but I think there would be a danger in changing too much here, because the core of this team has had a lot of success, and I think they're just trying to find a better mix around those players.
CJ, listen, great work as always, mate. Enjoy yourself, well-earned rest, and we'll chat to you in a few weeks' time.
It's going to be good, guys. Be well.
That's Chris Johnston of North Star Bets.